Hey guys, we are going to talk today about cladograms and phylogenetic trees. So these are ways that scientists organize different organisms. So we're looking at Georgia Standard of Excellence SB4A and B. So we should be able to obtain, evaluate, and communicate information to illustrate the organization of interacting systems within single and multi-celled organisms. And you should construct an argument supported by scientific information to explain patterns in structure and function among clades of organisms, including the origin of eukaryotes by endosymbiosis. Clades should include archaea, bacteria, eukaryotes, fungi, plants, and animals. And then you need to be able to analyze and interpret data to develop models like cladograms and phylogenetic trees based on patterns of common ancestry and the theory of evolution to determine relationships among major groups of organisms. So our goal for today is to be able to read a cladogram and use it to show relative connections between organisms, and also be able to interpret a phylogenetic tree. So first up, a cladogram. A cladogram is a super cool diagram that basically shows organisms and their characteristics that they share. So it shows how they are similar and how they're different. So it's a branching diagram. It shows these relationships. So here, the horse and the wolf, they're both connected or related because they both have hair. But the horse is not carnivorous, so it branches off before that trait of carnivorous happens. And then the wolf branches off. So as far as reading a cladogram, basically, when you read a cladogram, you start with the beginning on the furthest to the left. Sorry, I had to think about that. Start with the one furthest to the left, and that's going to be the oldest or first branched off organism. The one furthest to the right is the one that branched off the most recent. All relatives share a common ancestor that's at the root of the tree. Older organisms are at the bottom, and the four descendants at the top of the tree here, these are all different species. And this happens through a process called speciation. Now, within a cladogram, there are different clades. And a clade is just a group of organisms that come from a common ancestor. So if you cut a branch off of the tree, you would remove all the organisms that make up a specific clade. So the reason why this green one and this blue one up here are clades is because if you cut off that branch, you're going to take everything with it. The red and the kind of yellowy orange one are not clades because here we don't have a connection. Hang on. Here we don't have a connection between this one and these two. So that's not a clade because they come off of different branches. And here we left off a whole branch, so that's not a clade. As far as interpreting a cladogram, the organisms have to be above the characteristic in order for them to have the characteristic. The more characteristics they share, the more closely related they are. So if we look here, all of these organisms have a vertebra because vertebra is below everything here. Sharks branch off though, because sharks don't actually have a bony skeleton. Shark's skeleton is made up of cartilage, not bone. So sharks branch off. And then ray fin fish branch off because they don't have four limbs. Amphibians, primates, everything else has four limbs. So that's how we look at these characteristics. Each of these characteristics is here, and everything above the characteristic has that particular characteristic. So everything above where it says four limbs has four limbs. Everything above amniotic egg has an amniotic egg. So let's check out an Amoeba Sisters video.
When I was a little kid, I was really into animals. I used to get a magazine with animal facts that I loved to share with everyone, sometimes at inconvenient times. I particularly liked insects, which are animals, and I got really good at identifying them. but not perfect, and I recall identifying a certain insect as a bee. It looks like a honeybee, had the stripes, it was on the flower, and I went into my monologue of bee facts to my father, who also is really into entomology. He quietly remarked that it was in fact not a bee. No, it was actually a bee fly, which is classified as a different order than bees. Generally, honeybees have four wings, he said. Most flies, like bee flies, have two, and bee flies will not sting like honeybees do. Just tricking everyone. My pride was a little devastated. I remember going to the library and painstakingly looking through books into which I found these branchy diagrams that classified bee flies in the order Diptera, whereas bees can be found in the order Hymenoptera. These mysterious branchy diagrams returned again, many years later, when I first took biology. Except that time I learned the one I saw was called a cladogram, or cladogram. You may hear either pronunciation. The best way to introduce how a cladogram works, a hypothesis of relationships among organisms, is to try and build one. So, from our animals video, I'm going to select some animals here from a few different phyla. A type of frog, a type of sea bunny, a type of lancelet, a type of shark, and a maned wolf. Now let's say I have a chart here that looks like this. Going to put the 5 animals in the chart, randomly arranged. Now I'm going to put some specific characteristics in this top row. First is a notochord. Animals in the phylum Chordata have this, at least at some point in their development. A notochord is a flexible rod-like structure that runs along the back. To add, for animals that are vertebrates, it's there at embryonic development but often gets replaced by vertebrae, although remnants can often still be found. One of these animals is not in chordata, and thus does not have a notochord. Which is it? It's a sea bunny. We'll put an X on the notochord indicating the sea bunny doesn't have one. But all the other animals, they have it. Check. Next, vertebrae. This is for the vertebrate animals. We know the sea bunny is a no. Now these remaining animals are in the phylum Chordata. Most chordates have vertebrae, but one of the chordates here does not and is technically an invertebrate chordate. Which one? The lancelet. X on that, but the remaining have a check. Next, lungs. Which of these animals have lungs? This frog does, as an adult anyway, and so does the maned wolf. None of the others. Last, hair. Who has hair? The maned wolf, Petunia's favorite animal. Hair is a classic mammal characteristic. None of the others have hair. Okay, so we got this chart. Now what? Let's build a cladogram, a diagram that serves as a hypothesis for possible evolutionary relationships among these organisms based on these shared characteristics. I'm going to make a line and put the characteristics along here, starting with characteristics shared by all organisms in the group and moving to those shared by smaller groups. This is arranged using the most simple branching pattern, and it also reflects something called parsimony, meaning it is drawn using the fewest number of evolutionary changes for the characteristics listed. Now I'll add each organism based on the characteristics it has, placing each organism only after the characteristics it actually has. For example, the sea bunny has no notochord, so I'm placing it before that characteristic. The lancelet has a notochord but no vertebrae, so it goes after notochord but before vertebrae. The shark has both a notochord and vertebrae, so it goes past those two characteristics. Next, the frog. It has a notochord, vertebrae, and lungs. No hair though. Finally, the maned wolf. It has all of my selected characteristics. It goes here. You can see that the organism only gets placed beyond the listed characteristic if it has the characteristic. Now it's time to talk about what we have done. The whole thing is called a cladogram, a hypothesis of possible evolutionary relationships built on specific characteristics that are present in some of these organisms but not in others, as those can be indicators of common ancestry. Each intersection spot here represents a node, an intersection that can represent a common ancestor. This branch here that stems off this node can be considered a clade. A clade includes a common ancestor and its descendants. So while it can be one branch here, a clade can also include more branches. Now to note, our cladogram is not to any specific kind of scale. Our line in our cladogram does not represent a time scale. Instead, our cladogram shows physical characteristics that these organisms may share and could show potential evolutionary relationships. The sea bunny doesn't share any of the listed characteristics with these organisms. If I'm looking at the lancelet, shark, frog, and maned wolf, I would consider the sea bunny, which does not share any of the listed characters here, is an outgroup.
All right, you guys. So that's cladograms. Phylogeny is when we start looking at phylogenetic trees. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a species or a group of related species. Basically, phylogeny's goal is to trace the evolutionary history of living things on the planet. They really, scientists who focus on phylogeny, they would love to have the evolutionary history of all life on the planet traced. At this point, we don't have that, but they are trying. And it's based on the phylogenetic hypothesis that all living organisms share a common ancestry. So phylogenetic trees are a little bit different because they represent more time. And then they also represent just how closely related things are, but you don't see traits on phylogenetic trees. So evolutionary history is going to be represented in these phylogenetic trees, and the branches of the tree represent ancestral or descendant lineages. So this first question right down here, which I am going to also add in the presentation, but which two organisms are most closely related in this phylogenetic tree? So if we look at this, we've got humans, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans. Our orangutans, they branch off really early, so they're not related to anything hardly at all. I mean, they are, but they're not closely related. Our next branch is gorillas. So they don't fit. And then our next branch, were chimps and bonobos or humans. But chimps and bonobos, they come off the same branch. So they're going to be the two that are most closely related here. So let's check out the amoeba sisters on phylogenetic trees.
Can be represented in. There are a lot of programs that can build cladograms or phylogenetic trees. And I just said phylogenetic tree, a note on that term. It can be very common in conversation and textbooks to have the word cladogram used interchangeably with the word phylogenetic tree. Some sources use the term phylogenetic tree specifically when there is more detail. For example, the branch lengths are likely to be drawn intentionally to reflect a scale of time, and there's more data behind it, such as DNA data. Phylogenetic trees can be massive. Highly recommend a quick search for phylogenetic tree of bees and flies, and you'll see what we mean. The main point is that cladograms and phylogenetic trees help us visualize possible evolutionary relationships among groups of organisms. Building cladograms helps us practice how to group the organisms by evidence such as homologous structures or molecular data, and these models can be altered as we gather new data. To learn more about how this data can show evolutionary relationships, you can
Now, coming up soon, we're going to learn more about those things that they mentioned, like DNA evidence and homologous structures and things like that. That's coming up next week. So that's everything that I have for you for this presentation. Hopefully it made sense. If you have any questions, as always, don't hesitate to let me know in class, and I will see you guys for our next class session coming up soon. Bye, guys.